EmberJS. Hey, I'm Jason Ardell, and yeah, I'm going to be speaking about EmberJS today. And Ember is, I guess, sort of kick it off by saying it's an opinionated, full-featured JavaScript MVC framework. But there's sort of a lot more to it than that. So just first off, a little introduction. You can find me at github.com/Ardell, and that's my company, Agile Engineering. We work with startups to help them build out their minimum viable product using typically Rails and JavaScript MVC kind of frameworks. So yeah. So first I'd like to talk a little bit, kind of the elephant in the room always when we talk about any MVC framework is what does MVC mean in JavaScript, and what are all the different options that I have available. So I just wanted to take a quick poll. Who here has used a JavaScript MVC framework before? Cool. And then Backbone, Ember, Angular, Meteor, Spine, let's see, Batman, others? I don't know. Others? Any? Knockout, yeah, Knockout, thank you. Sprout, really? Awesome, so you'll be very familiar. Sprout actually turned into Ember. Sorry, say again? Thorax, cool, awesome. Well, great. So there's a lot of options out there, and I want to tell you, I won't do a ton of comparing today. There's a lot of comparison going on the internet, and you can read a lot of flame wars about all of that stuff. But I'm going to tell you why I like Ember, and why I think you ought to check it out, and it's worthy of looking into as you're comparing and making a decision about which JavaScript MVC framework you might want to use. So one other poll, actually, I'm curious, who comes to JavaScript from building server-side stuff in like Rails or PHP or things like that? Cool. And then who comes to JavaScript from like iOS development? Anybody? Okay. And from other desktop sort of development environments? Okay, cool. Anything else that what am I missing? Nothing. Oh, from nothing. Okay. That's awesome too. Well, good. So when we're talking about JavaScript, I'm going to use MVC and MV star and all that. Model view controller is sort of the typical pattern there, but I'm going to use those terms interchangeably because in JavaScript with MVC frameworks, they're extremely varied in terms of what their components are. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case, but I'll use those terms interchangeably. But the main reason why you want to use that, like say, you've been building sites in Rails and you've been using jQuery to communicate with the server back and forth. When your app reaches a certain critical mass, you get to the point where you realize, holy cow, this thing is really disorganized. And it turns into spaghetti code, and it's really unmaintainable. So using an MVC framework allows you to have sort of a project structure that you can recognize later on as you're coming back to it. You get great things like two-way data binding. So for you all who have been doing iOS kind of stuff, you'll recognize that. That'll be really familiar to you and really valuable to you. You get routing just like you do in any web framework. It's kind of different routing because you're going to be using either hash structures or you're going to be using some of the browser history functionality. And then you get templating. So, and this goes sort of with the two-way data binding. You can use handlebars, mustache, jQuery templates, all that kind of stuff in order to declaratively say this is what I want my app state represented as, and that'll feel like ERB or Smarty if you used PHP. So yeah. So next I want to talk about this continuum from libraries all the way to frameworks. So there's probably, I'm guessing a lot of folks in the room have used jQuery, probably some underscore folks as well. This is where I started out, was, as I mentioned, building web apps on the server side, and that's where I came from. And so I would just sort of put in some jQuery here and there when I needed to make things interactive, and that was pretty good because you got fade ins and fade outs and slide ups and slide downs, and that's really great. You can update HTML. You could listen for click events. You can respond to user interactions in a sensible way. So that and sort of underscore, and there are many others, but those are sort of, I'll make the argument, those are libraries. And on the other side, we have frameworks, and frameworks are more aggressive. They have some opinions, and they want to help you address certain problems. And it's largely they want to help you build an app. Libraries want to help you just sort of pepper in some functionality. Frameworks want to help you make an app. So come out here, but so jQuery _ on the library side. Frameworks, if you don't recognize the logos. So we've got Angular, Ember, and Backbone and Marionette. The reason that you see the Backbone logo here twice is Backbone is really pretty interesting. It's extremely popular as a JavaScript MVC framework, and its philosophy is it is not to make too many decisions for you. It's to allow you to have maximum flexibility to pull in components that you want to use, and be extremely flexible. So Marionette is a library that sort of helps you make some of those decisions, and then helps you reduce boilerplate code as you're integrating those things together. So it's not really fair to compare. I don't think, Brian, throw tomatoes at me if I'm wrong here, but it's not really fair, I guess, to compare Backbone with Angular in that sense, because it doesn't make as many decisions for you. But comparing it with a combination of Backbone and Marionette is probably a little bit more appropriate. So TodoMVC was really helpful for me as I was getting started comparing frameworks. We had a project that we were working on, and we wanted to do it in a JavaScript framework on the front end, and thinking, holy cow, I've got all these options. What am I going to use? And so what TodoMVC is it's a project, TodoMVC.com. It's a project that aims at implementing basically this same app. It's a to-dos app, so you can say, do this stuff and then check it off. It's very, very simple, but in all these different frameworks, it implements the exact same app. And different people who are pretty darn good at those frameworks have gone through and implemented them. So you can see what are the common patterns, how do the frameworks compare. You can see a lot of good comparison stuff there. So definitely check that out. So for me, TodoMVC was meant to be sort of instructional. It was meant to be really portable, obviously, between all these different apps. Generally speaking, it only uses sort of what you'd be familiar with from the server side as views and controllers, kind of templates and doing some actions. It doesn't have a real strong sense of models or persistence. In fact, most of them persist to local store. And so local store is really great for doing stuff like TodoMVC, because it's not flaky. Like you don't get a lot of validation errors back from local store very often, and it's sort of dumb. It takes a blob of data and you put it in local storage, and then you ask for the same blob of data back. So it's kind of dumb, which to me, since I'm developing against a server, I have to worry about all those things. I have to worry about timeouts. I have to worry about validation errors. So TodoMVC is really great and was really helpful for me, but it has its limits. So I just want to, those are things to keep in mind as you're looking through TodoMVC. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the server side versus client side needs, right? So on the server side, one thing that you may really like about the server side is that you take a request in and you process that request, and then you give a response, and that's all that you really have to worry about. You don't have to worry about, you don't have to worry so much about how much garbage collection I'm doing, because ultimately, it's a very short-lived kind of process, and that's different if you're using, queue workers and those sorts of things in the background. But it's different on the client side. So we've got the request response nature of the server side, but on the client side, you've got a persistent app. And what that means is every object that you create is living until you tell it to die. Your framework may take care of some of that for you, but you have to just constantly be conscious of how much stuff you're generating and whether or not that stuff is going away. So yeah, that's garbage collection. And then also error handling is one that you don't really think about. It's if I get a 404 on the server side, I can make a nice pretty 404 page that is returned to the user, and that's pretty simple to do. But doing that on the client side, you're getting an AJAX response back, and you have to put up your own message for it. So these are some things to think about. the main point is on the client side, you don't know what you don't know. So when I was starting with on the server side, taking HTML and putting did anybody else start out like this? Taking HTML and just putting some dynamic content in there. Did anybody? Am I not alone on this? So way early days, I had no idea why do I need routes? What are routes for? Why do I need ORMs? I can just write SQL at the top of my file. That works great, doesn't it? So why would I need all those things? But the point is, you don't know what you don't know, and especially if you're coming at this from the server side. I want to convince you that there are a lot of client-side things that you may not know about that aren't going to be familiar to you from the server side that are concerns, and you need to think about them. Or you need to specifically adopt a framework that takes care of that stuff for you. So routing ORM and persistence to your web services, event binding, and that goes with garbage collection. Template composition, being able to say, I've got this view here, and then I want to add these partials, or I want to implement these controls here, and how do I do that? And then dependency management, and that's actually a lot on the server side as well. So if you come from the server side, specifically this is about Ember, what I think you'll appreciate, and you'll see instances of these specific things. You'll appreciate that we have templates, that Ember has templates, that it'll feel just like if you're in Rails ERB or Smarty in PHP, etc. That you have a concept of URLs, that those URLs mean something. When I go in my blog, I go to /posts/1, that I pull up that particular blog post. And then I can always go there. I can tweet that out on Twitter, and someone is going to actually go back to that same place in my app. You'll like Ember Data, I think. Ember Data is still very early, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. It's like it's similar to Active Record. It's an ORM. It's sort of an ORM for the client side. And then separation of data store from presentation. So this is huge. One of the main reasons that we wanted to develop when I was building my first Ember app, the reason that we wanted to build using a client-side JavaScript MVC framework was because we wanted to build an API on the back end and have everybody use the same API. We had an iPhone app, we had a web app, and we were a photography company supporting photographers, so we had a Lightroom plugin too. And we wanted everything to be able to use that same API. And actually, we wanted to allow our clients to access that API as well. So if they wanted to have programmatic access into our application, they could do so. And so using JavaScript on the client side, JavaScript MVC frameworks on the client side, it forces you to have that separation of concerns, to have a client that's accessing in the exact same way that everybody else is accessing your data. That's what the client is using too. So the main concerns, and I've got a couple slides on if you come from the client side. It didn't seem like there were many people that came from the client side, but it sounded like we've got people coming from the server side. Some confusion points that were things that were confusing for me at first. The event-driven architecture, if you're not familiar with that, if you haven't done a ton of JavaScript, subscribing to events, that's sort of new, or it can be new depending on what your server-side framework is. What the responsibility of the router is in Ember is very different. And object controllers versus array controllers. I'm curious, how many folks know what an object controller should be used for versus an array controller? Yeah. So exactly. So that's they're used controllers are used very as a way to access through to models, and so you'll have to do a lot of learning as associated with that. And then asynchronicity and promises, really, really cool stuff. But that'll trip you up. But really, it all comes down to a lot of this. There's some things that are scary, but there are a lot of things that are really darn consistent, and it makes a lot of sense. So you probably recognize this architecture. I've got a database. I've got models that access that database. I've got controllers that are brokering between views and models, and that makes a ton of sense on the server side. Well, on the client side, it just sort of looks like this. You've got an app within an app. So I've got my same database models and controllers, and those controllers are going to return serialized JSON instead of views that the user is looking at. And then on the client side, I'm going to have models that are talking to this big old database in the sky, and all that is a set of JSON services. So, or XML, or whatever you prefer to use. And so this is sort of your data store layer. This is, and then you've got fairly similar models, views, and controllers on the front end that you've used. So for me, I use Rails a lot, and so what we use is ERB, Haml, or Slim controllers. That's provided by Rails. You get Action Controller out of the box. You get Active Record out of the box as an ORM, and then we have Postgres or MongoDB or whatever you want to use as your data store. On the JavaScript side, though, it was always sort of a big question mark. I have to do the same things, but it's just JavaScript code. So nobody had really organized those things before JavaScript MVC frameworks came along. So the way that you used to do this, right, was you use jQuery event listeners to call jQuery Ajax, and it would hit a RESTful API, and you would use $HTML to update your views, right? And that seems very sensible until you get an app that has 10 views, and then you're like, holy crap, what did I do? It's a real mess. So it's not testable. It's spaghetti code, callback hell. It's not, you're repeating yourself all over the place, and it's just code smells. It's just awful. So now JavaScript MVC frameworks were introduced, and so you use let's say Backbone or Angular for your controllers. For your ORM, those guys come with Backbone sync. Angular has different HTTP capacities along with their models. And then you hit the same RESTful API. That's good. You can reuse that. And then you can use handlebars. You can use Mustache. All sorts of different frameworks on the front end. And I want to talk to you a little bit about declarative templates. This is really cool. This is handlebars here. The idea is, if I want to render a series of books in a list, instead of having to slam HTML into that view every single time that changes, I just declare it once and I say, this is what I want it to look like. I want it to loop through all of my books, and I want to spit out their title. And then if I don't have any, then I just want to say, hey, there are no results. So instead of actually having to implement the event listeners and all that stuff, you can just declare it once and have it. So you have your application state that changes out from underneath you, and then handlebars picks up that change and it just re-renders. So that really helps to clean things up significantly. So the one thing that seems to still, for me, require a lot of customization was on the ORM side, or accessing my data store. And the reason is, I think that data stores, specifically RESTful APIs, tend to be, it's the Wild West, right? I can go out and create a new standard if I want. I can make it whatever namespace I want it to be. I can make up my own paths. There are all of these concerns, authentication, the number one. And so it's really difficult for any JavaScript MVC framework to sort of support everybody and have a really comprehensive solution to that. Backbone and Angular, they have facilities for that, but for instance, Backbone Syncs is only 50 lines of code, and you can't really expect 50 lines of code to do all that much for you. So instead, what I found to be really helpful for me was a combination of Ember and Ember data, and RESTful APIs provided by Rails, and then handlebars on the front end. And this is Ember's default setup. This is, and I guess sort of, Ember data is still very early on, and so there are a lot of people who aren't using Ember data. It's not advertised as being production ready. There are people who are using it on production, but in any case, what I'll argue is that this is today and will continue to be in the future a really great way to integrate your stack all the way from JavaScript at the very, very front end with your templates to the back end of your RESTful API, and specifically with Ember, Ember Data, and Rails. And when I'm talking about Rails, I don't mean like, this is only working for Rails, and if you're using Django, you're totally out of luck. So Rails' philosophy, and Ember sort of agrees with this, is we're going to give you a great experience at the front, and then if you want to substitute out modules here and there, then you're welcome to do so. But we want to give you conventions that make sense. So Ember absolutely agrees with that. So I talked about the RESTful API on the right-hand side, and the tool that has really helped me, and actually Ember Data, their opinion is, we intend to go forward with active model serializers as our way of making really, really standard APIs in Ruby. And so you're probably familiar with this. It's a show action. So if I go to like post/1, then I'm going to load the post up. I'm going to find it by its ID, and then I'm going to respond with here format.json. I'm going to return a JSON representation of this post here. Now, how does Rails know what to render when I just return that post? Well, that's what a serializer is. And this is a serializer. The idea is that anytime that I reference a post, whether it's all by itself or it's in an array of posts, Rails knows how to, because of active model serializers knows how to render that. So I tell it, hey, I want you to give me an ID, a title, and the text. And actually this is extremely cool, that my post has many comments, and please include them. I want those to be side-loaded, and I'll show you how that works. And it also has many tags, and so with one request, I can get everything that I need to know about a post. And the same is true if I want to list all of my posts. If I go to /posts in order to get the index of all my posts, it's going to return me an array of all those posts, but then it's also going to sideload in all the comments that are referenced by any of them, and all the tags that are referenced by any of them. So Ember plays Ember Data plays extremely nicely with active model serializers, and it's been a huge time saver for us. So this is the JSON that's returned if you go to post/1.json with that controller and those serializers. So I have my ID, title, body, and then I have a list of comment IDs and tag IDs for this guy. And then the comments they're literally side-loaded in. So I've got posts here, I've got an array of comments, and I've got an array of tags. And so this is awesome if you're talking about a mobile experience, because instead of having to make multiple requests out, I can sideload all this data into one and have my framework understand it and create the right objects so that I can access post.comments, and I can loop through those comments and not have to make an additional request for each one. So, and this is Ember Data. Ember Data is what you'll use for models, and it's what you'll use to tell Ember how to connect to your backend. So over on this side, this is on the server side. This is my model. So translate to your language of choice. But I've got a post, and it has, again, an author. It has comments and tags, and it has a title and some text. I mean, it's meant to be very translatable from the Ruby side over here over to, this is CoffeeScript. But this is, so DS is Ember Data's namespace, and so it's creating a model, and it says a post belongs to an author, and it has many comments, and it has many tags. It's meant to be readable, and it's meant to be extremely similar between Active Record and Ember Data. So, by the way, so you can access, just like I mentioned, you can access embedded records if you're sideloading the data in. So if I've declared a post and I have that post object now in JavaScript or CoffeeScript, then I can say, hey, post.comments, and it'll list all of the comments for me. And it'll actually do that regardless of whether you're sideloading the data in. It'll be smart enough to figure out whether it's actually got those related objects or not, and then it'll go out and fetch those from the server too. Just real quickly, I wanted to touch on this. If you do end up using Ember with Rails, there's an Ember-Rails Gem that adds some generators for you, so you can easily install Ember. You can bootstrap your sort of your directory structure and get a really sensible directory structure. Also, it allows you to separate out your handlebars templates. So if you have a template for showing, I can show this too, showing a list of posts, showing a post, and then maybe some partials for editing posts and creating new posts and that sort of stuff. Usually you have to include those all. A lot of folks will just include them all in the index.html file, or they'll include them all in a single include. But instead, this Ember-Rails Gem will allow you to process those in the default way that Ember include, or that Rails includes all of your JavaScripts. And so that's a really handy thing to have. So, as I said, Ember's philosophy, similar to Rails, is that it's convention over configuration. So we're going to give you a great set of defaults out of the box, something that is well-trodden path. It's well set up for you. There's not a lot of friction to getting it set up. Not that there's no friction, there is, but that it's minimal friction. And then you can configure anything that you prefer to change out of that. I really love Ember for the fact that it has a great team behind it, and that was something that was really important to me as I was choosing frameworks. So Yehuda Katz and Tom Dale is another one. So Yehuda was a core maintainer on Rails. He also was a core contributor to jQuery, and so that gives me a good feeling that he understands my concerns from both the server side as well as from the client side, like JavaScript side. And I really appreciate that. I really value that. I have no need to learn a new mental model because of the conventions, because it's meant to be fairly similar to Rails. I have a unified stack. I have something that is meant to work as a whole. And even though it can be swapped out, it's a really good story to be able to use these things as they're meant to be sort of intended to be used. And it's designed to work out of the box with active model serializers. So that really cleans things up. So next, I'd like to look at some code. I put together just a really simple app. Basically went through and created a really simple blog tutorial. I'll click around this a little bit for you. You can notice that, so I'm running it locally, but I'm using a hashed URL. So /post, so this just takes me, basically the # means that it's not going to reload the page if I go to a different route. So I'm going to navigate here, and that changed to post /1. I can go to a different post here, and it's loading these things. By the way, this hasn't reloaded any data from the server. I've loaded it all in that first request. As long as we're doing read operations, it's not going to load anything. And in fact, if I go here and I edit this, as long as I don't make any changes, that hasn't sent anything to the server either. It's smart enough to know whether a record is dirty or not. So it's not making superfluous requests. I can actually go in and edit this guy. And you notice it updates right there. So this is pretty much every JavaScript MVC framework you're going to use has two-way data binding, and that's actually what's coming into play here. Is when I update this text box, this text here, this link, is actually bound to the value of this guy. It's bound to the same underlying object, and so when I change this in the text box, it gets updated in the back end. That's what I was referring to when I was talking about handlebars, and you change the state out from under it, and then it just makes the representation. Nothing has had to, there's no sort of event listener that I had to program in order to make that happen. It just does it for you. So yeah, we'll save that, and so that'll hit the server. I should be able to refresh, and yeah, it persisted through more here. You can also make comments, and I'll show that a little too. I just wanted to walk you all through this a little bit. There are a lot, by the way, there are a lot of really great screencasts out there. And I've got links to them later in the presentation, but there are a lot of really great presentations out there that screencasts that walk you through exactly how would I build this from the ground up. Like, how do I get from 0 to effectively something very similar to this in terms of a functional app. But I figured we probably didn't have enough time to do that tonight, and I'd spare you all. So let's see. We'll switch the bearing actually. Okay, so this is my app. And basically everything happens within the app directory. All of our JavaScripts and CoffeeScripts and static-ish assets go in the assets directory. I want to show you real quickly. I want to show you real quickly a couple things. So first of all, the serializers. So we've got a post serializer here, and this is identical to what you saw before. It's got an attribute, it's got an ID, title, text, and it has many comments. And then the representation here is, this is just a JSON API. So I'm sideloading all my comments in, and then also I've got all my posts. I can also go to post/1, and it'll just return me that particular post. So that's really handy, and it makes it really easy to build a very consistent API, which is really valuable to me. Not too much interesting with model or controllers. That's mostly servers. It's all server-side stuff. So why don't we step into the JavaScripts here, and we'll talk first about router.coffee. So Ember has a philosophy that routes are at the center of everything. That basically all the magic happens when I go to /posts. So you notice it redirected there. This is Ember cares about like what page you're on, and because it wants to be able to have sensible URLs. It wants to be able to navigate to deep link into your entire app, and so they sort of build everything around this idea of routes. This is Ember's router, or this is the Ember router for this particular app. It says, hey, I've got this resource, this thing in my system that's called posts, and within those posts, I've got a couple actions that I can do. I've got new, so I can go ahead and create a new post, and that's going to be at /posts/new, and so that's how I would create a new post. And then I've got this post within posts, and so that's a single instance. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a route for accessing that particular post, given the post ID. So let's see how that's done a little bit. In addition to this definition of the overall route structure here, I've also got an individual posts route, for instance. So what this is going to do, this gets loaded when I go to /posts. It's going to say, hey, I want to find all the posts in the system, and then I want to set the content of my controller. I'm going to want to loop through all of these posts in the future. So please let me do that. And that's actually how this works here. You'll notice that we do loop through those guys and we spit them out. And let's go see how that's done. So in templates and posts. This is handlebars, and this is the piece that we're talking about here is each post in my controller. I'm gonna loop through those, and I'm gonna put list items for them, and I'm gonna have them be links and spitting out the post title. Then, in addition to that, I can click on this. That's what this link to does. This link to enables me to click on that guy. Notice in the bottom here it says /post/1. So Ember is hooking this up based on, hey, I've got this post, and this is a variable in the system. Are you all able to see that highlighting at all? I'm sorry, it's in the dark. And then I'm going to link to this specific post. So I want to go to posts1, and Ember figures all that out for you, all of your routes. So let's see. In addition to that, I'd like to show the model. This makes this is very similar to what I was showing before. The one I want to concentrate on here is just this ds.hasMany comment. And as I said, those comments are sideloaded. And for instance, when I go into my posts view, I can see here that when I'm when I'm editing that post, I look through a list of comments. So those are related records that it's actually pulling in because I've set up this has many relationship. So I can loop through the comments associated with that post without ever having to worry about how that gets populated. It just works. So that's pretty cool. And the last thing I sort of want to point out about this is I have action, or I have some state as well. So I define this state as in editing. So when I want to edit a post in place, I click on this and it changes. So I have a text box and a text area. That's actually what's buried in this post's form. That's shared with the new view, and so I don't have to repeat code. That should be fairly familiar to you. And then I have this button that's saved. And so what that's actually triggering is over on in our post controller, since we're editing a post. I initialize is editing to false. Hey, when I load the page, I don't want to be editing anything. But when I click on this edit, when I click on the edit button right here, this is what happens. It sets is editing to true, and I don't have to do anything else. And instead, it just changes from using all this content down here to using this content up here. And then when I click save, it's going to get the content of this controller, which, by the way, is our post. That makes sense. And then it's going to save it to the server, and that's all you have to do in order to save. You don't have to do mess with any AJAX stuff. There's not a whole lot of back-end work that I've done in order to make that work. It's just that's what Ember data does for you. So I just get to save it, and then I get to set is editing to false, and then we're done. The same is true with adding a comment. So I can edit a comment directly from the screen, and it just it adds the comment, and then it saves it, and then it clears out the fields. So actually, this may be helpful. You notice probably that everything was happening on the same page, and it doesn't have to be that way. On the client side, people have traditionally found it really useful to be able to do, since you've got a state, being able to do a master detail view, which is like I've got my email messages on the left side, and then I've got the detail view. If I click on one of those email messages, then I get to open it on the right side, and that's effectively what's happening here. I've got my big application handlebars, and that's the guy that sets up everything, and it just places my title there. And then really all that he has inside there, he has a title and this thing called an outlet. And outlets are the way that you sort of nest functionality within your page. So application has the title and then an outlet, and into that outlet renders my posts view, my post.handlebars. So this is the one that lists my post, and then inside this blue box is another outlet. And what's going to render into there is my specific post. So if I have like /post/1, then that's what's going to render into this blue box. So that's sort of how that kind of stuff works. Again, that will seem probably pretty foreign to you if you're coming from the server side, but that's it. I guess that's an artifact of the fact that Ember it's a client-side library, and so there are different paradigms associated with it. So if you're interested, how should you learn Ember and EmberJS? There's a great Peep Code screencast that was released at, I guess, February or so, March this year, February. And by the way, all these slides are up, so I'll post the link at the end. But it's really great. It's worth your time. It's long. It's like an hour and a half, hour 45 minutes long, and it walks you through step by step. How do I create an Ember app? And it doesn't go into Ember data. It focuses specifically on Ember. It was written, the guy who recorded it was sitting side by side with Yehuda and Tom Dale while he did it. And so it's not only is it, here's how you can build Ember apps, it's like, here's how you should build Ember apps. So I highly recommend that. It's $12, just so you know. Also, Ryan Bates has released 2 Rails casts that also focus specifically on Ember. And he's got a premium model where you pay $9 a month for all the Rails casts you can drink. And then, but the core takeaway with this is pay to learn unless your time is worthless. And I'm willing to bet that that's not true for, that nobody in here's time is worth it. So like your time is valuable. Please pay to learn Ember, or for that matter, really any JavaScript MVC framework. You're going to get the best content if you pay for it. And otherwise, you're going to spend your time bashing your head against a wall, and that's not really very much fun for anybody. So I highly encourage you to pay to learn. There are, in addition to that, there are also Ember guides. There are API docs, Stack Overflow. There's also a site called Discourse, app called Discourse that was written in Ember, and there's a community around that. It's discuss.emberjs.com, and so that'll answer a lot of questions as well for you. Just a couple shout outs. If you're interested in working with Ember, let's have a beer. I'd love to sort of talk and find out what you're interested in doing, whether Ember might be a good use case for you. I've also used Backbone and Angular, so if it's not the right fit for you, I can point you in that direction. And specifically, actually, one really important thing to consider as you're choosing a framework is that they're not all right for the right circumstances. For instance, Ember wants to take over your whole page. Like that's what it's good at. It's meant to be, this is my framework for rendering my app. And there are other frameworks out there, Angular and Backbone, both, that don't require that, and they're not opinionated to that extent. And so if you're looking to have, I guess, what is referred to as interactive islands in your application, then Ember's not a good choice for you. And so you'll want to look at Angular, Backbone, Batman, Thorax, all these other as well. And then also, if you need help on a project, that's what we do. We build web apps, so come talk to me. I'd love to talk about how we can help. Any questions?
So I had a couple. Can I go both of them at the same time?
Please.
Okay. So firstly, you mentioned you use some tools for like garbage collection events, and I just want to know what tools you've used.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question was you mentioned timeouts and validation and getting a garbled response back from the server. How does Ember handle that?
Okay, so the first one first. Tools that
event.
Tools for garbage collection, event handling, those sorts of things. So Ember actually handles those things for you to a large extent. You have to make sure that you're not leaving references. You're not like sort of abandoning references to child records and things like that. But otherwise, Ember's good about when a view leaves the page, it gets rid of it and it collects it. It releases it such that the JavaScript garbage collection can happen, can take that object out. So that's true with for garbage collection. For event handling, Ember also takes care of that for you. They have hooks in there in your views, so that when you're setting up event handlers, you can like have a setup and a teardown if you're implementing them implementing them yourself. But they also have out-of-the-box ones that, for instance, you can just implement a click method. Instead of having to attach the click handler to a particular object, you can just implement a click method, and it'll do setup and teardown for you. So then the second question
was around like timeouts and getting garbled response or validation error.
Okay, so validation is an interesting one. Ember is they've got a story. They've got a story for it. They've had one so far. It's okay. This is an Ember day actually. It's an okay story for validation on the client side. But there are several pull requests out there actually that should be merged in the next month or so probably. They're sort of refactoring the way that they communicate with the server all told, refactoring it to be based entirely on promises. And so promise basically, if you haven't used it before, promise says, hey, do this, and then once you're finished doing that, then run this code. So it allows you to sort of chain things together and do so without having a lot of, if you've ever been in callback hell where your JavaScript code just sort of goes like this because you're going inside a callback, inside a callback, inside a callback, inside a callback. Promise is sort of free from that, so they're refactoring to that. Timeouts and getting garbled messages, that's stuff that you do have to do in user land. So, yeah. Okay.
So I know that the idea is to have your business logic in the controllers to some extent, but when you have a lot of business logic for interactions between your models, where do you put something like that?
When you have interaction between your models. So, so first of all, controller, it's sort of a tricky word, right? MV star, MVC, right? Controller on the client side, the purpose of that is to, really, it's to broker listening to events and causing things to happen on the data side. So yes and no with putting the business logic in the controllers. On the server side, especially, you want to have really skinny controllers and really fat models or really fat libraries that you can implement business logic on. So,
just to give you an example, so if I have an object with multiple children, normally this object controller children is on, right?
Mhm.
You don't want to send that call to the server just to get a hey, you still have children
right.
existing. So if I were to have the logic in the controller for the delete action to say, hey, check for all the kids, make sure they're gone, and then allow it to delete, that seems like you have a massive controller, or if you, let's say an object controller, after a little while, you put all that logic in the controller. So is there ways for that?
Yeah, so actually, one of my favorite features of Ember Data is that it supports transactions. So you can say, hey, I'm going to start this transaction, I'm going to do a bunch of stuff to my models, and then finally I want to either commit or roll back. So this is huge on the client side because I can allow somebody to edit in real life. So I change the title to foobar or whatever, and I'm editing that thing, but I haven't committed the transaction yet. I haven't saved the record. If I want to cancel, oh no, what do I do? I've already changed my record on the client side. What if somebody else goes and saves it? Well, they have this capacity where you can begin a transaction and you can either commit or roll it back, and so you can allow people to edit freely and not be worried about how all of these things sort of tie together. You can start a transaction, you can delete the parent record and have that cascade if you want. You can say, hey, delete all your kids and then delete yourself, and then finally commit the transaction. Does that?
Yeah, I mean, I get the data part of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that when I was developing Rails, I had if I were to do anything, I had basically just one file that had, if I were to delete a particular thing or run a particular function, there was just one place where I would make that call. Right? It would be like a global model that if I make that call, it always checks other things before it allows that call to go through. Right? So that logic is like a server-side thing that I wondered if it's possible to do well on the client side.
Yeah, it depends on your case, whether you put that in your object controller or whether you put it directly in the model. It's probably a case-by-case decision, but I definitely encourage you to look into transaction.
One of the things I was thinking is that you could have, because I know this is all, there's all inheritance in the front end. So I could make a controller with a ton of this logic in it, right? And then have all my controls inherit from it in some way. And then whenever I want to delete an object, it goes back to the parent.
Yeah, and consider also that JavaScript has different ways. Like, it doesn't only have classical inheritance. It also has, you can do mix-ins and you can monkey patch your objects and all these great things that you can do that you don't necessarily have to have this classical inheritance where I'm inheriting and my class names get about that long. Like, you have cool stuff that you can do from that perspective too. So, any other questions? You got one back there?
You said you work with Angular, so I think you probably understand the pain of directives where you have to wrap all this special jQuery code in Angular language to make it work. How does Ember compare as far as being able to just drop in a full jQuery plugin?
Yeah, so I've done a good amount of that on the Ember side, and what I've done is it really actually has to do with what we were talking about, where you implement a custom view and you say, hey, this is going to be my autocomplete view, and you can bind stuff to that view. You say, hey, since it's an autocomplete, I probably want it to extend a text field, and Ember's got a text field out of the box. So I'll have it extend the text field, and then I can bind it to a function so that it knows how to get all of its auto-suggest results. But sort of the way that gets set up, like, I don't implement that stuff myself. Instead, I pull in a jQuery plugin that does autocomplete. And so the way that happens is when you set up the view object, you call it to jQuery and say, hey, decorate self. Basically, you've got a reference to the view has a reference to my jQuery object, my DOM element. And so you can say, hey, decorate myself. And then when he gets torn down, you just apply a teardown method that says, get rid of self, like, combine. So, does that make sense? Cool.
How do you deal with situations in your templates when you need extremely fine-grained control? Like, looking at the handlebars, I would imagine, like, when it's iterating through each of the posts, like when you add posts to the model, it's just automatically going to show up. What happens when you need to control, like, exactly how you want that view or that piece of HTML to appear? You want to temporarily transition it or apply effects or do a loading view while your models and stuff are loading. How can you have that level of control with, like the two-way data binding out of the box?
So a couple things. You can have on render or on when the element gets inserted. Like let's say you insert a new comment and you want that comment to flash. You can have it if you've got a view instance for that guy. When he renders, you can say, hey, I want you to slide down instead of just appearing. So that's one thing you can do. You can also, if you're talking about sort of more logic kind of stuff, you can say on your each loop. In fact, let's just go back to that. So on each here, you can actually specify an object controller. So if you want to decorate this object, what an object controller is it's got one item in it, and that's its content. But that controller actually proxies all the requests back to that model. So you can implement stuff on the controller side. You can say, hey, I want you to dance or do a flip or whatever. And then if you don't implement that method on the object controller, then it'll just pass it straight back to the model. So you can decorate that sort of from a logic perspective as well when you're looping through. And that's true of any view. You don't have to be doing each. You can do that, and you can just insert an Ember view here or a view that you created as well. This is actually looping. A really common case for Ember is to loop, instead of looping through an array of objects, you loop through an array controller. And so what an array controller is very similar to an object controller. It's going to proxy calls, but it allows you to implement methods on that collection of objects. So you could say, for instance, this is how you do filtering and sorting. So by default you get a content array, and that would be the array of books. But if I wanted to sort those books, then I can implement an arranged content method where I can say, hey, sort those books by title or sort them by author or sort them by whatever key the user has chosen in that select box. So that's a really powerful concept in Ember. The same is true with filtering. In addition to sorting, you just want to filter those records first. So array controllers and object controllers are extremely powerful, and they allow you to sort of decorate and do complex logic on that stuff. There are some tricky cases though, for sure, and animations can be a challenge. Okay.
My team's got a prototype right now, and we're looking to transition it to more of a client-side Ember or backbone or something. And right now, it's going to be a self-contained app, kind of like what you're talking about. But we can see in the future where we might want to drop it into our main site. Would Ember be a good use case for that? Like, can it be adapted to drop in somewhere?
I haven't done a whole lot of work with that, so let's talk offline. I'll see what we can. One of the use cases for that is when doing testing, the Ember team wanted a way to be able to render without having to take over the URLs, which is sort of the primary purpose. They wanted to be able to still have routes and still be able to do transitions, but render it into a browser that was actually just Phantom.js or be able to test. So they do have a capacity for doing that. I'm just not. I I need to research a little bit more.
Does Ember.js have a way to have a built-in way of paging? Like, say you had 1,000 posts and you only wanted to load
Yep.
10 of them at a time.
They do not, and that's been a real, that's been a pain point for me. There is a pull request open right now on, so, by the way, I don't know if I'd love to know for other frameworks if this is true, but I find myself, I'm on GitHub a lot of the time, like looking at pull requests, seeing sort of what's coming down the pipe for Ember, and especially for Ember data since it's pretty green. But there's a pull request out for pagination right now, and I'm really looking forward to that. And it's a real pain point for me. We've got an app that loads 1,000 records, and I want to be able to page those and not have to load all 1,000. I want to be able to load 30 of them, and then auto load more when they scroll down the page, etc. So I'm looking forward to that. But it's something that core maintainers know about that it's missing, and so hopefully soon. And pull request will help them, I guess, is their philosophy on that, right?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Anything else?
Can you go to the posts route? Oh, in text, sorry.
The posts route.
Yeah. Is there a reason they use a setup controller instead of just an object?
Yes. So setup controllers run every time. This is actually, you're right, this is an instance of where the default is the same. Setup controllers run every time regardless of whether or not the model has been loaded. And model is only run if it hasn't before. So in this case, it's the same. There are cases where we're doing this. Anything else?
Sorry, I had one.
No?
So, yeah, again, two things.
Okay,
So,
one at a time.
One at a time.
My brain's not that big.
All right. So you mentioned transactions, right?
Yep.
So is that just client-side transaction, or is that?
It's only client-side transactions. So if it fires off, it may fire off 3 different XHRs, and it's not like your server side doesn't understand
Right.
that those things have to happen atomically. If they do, then the right way to do that probably is to implement that as one request.
Right.
So
And how does Ember fare on sort of a mobile device, like through a mobile browser? Like, have you had a chance to use it, or what's the mobile story?
Yeah, we have developed stuff for iPad. It works well. So there's been a lot of discussion lately about how JavaScript performs on mobile devices in general, and especially when you're using something sort of as heavy as a JavaScript MVC framework can be. Then there's some concern about performance. We've run into that, and you have to be careful about how many objects you load, and hence the need for pagination and those sorts of things. But yeah, it works. It performs. Responsive design really helps with that kind of stuff. A lot of questions. Great.
One of the requirements for us is coming up with a domain-specific language and reusable components. And we found it very easy to do with EmberJS, where you can write custom directories and then create components and then reuse them across projects. So how difficult is the learning curve with Ember, and how can we do such stuff with Ember?
Writing domain-specific languages in Angular, or using domain-specific languages.
In the sense, we can come up with our own HTML tags, service order or something that's missing, and then we can reuse them across different projects. So
Right, the directives, yeah. So Angular's philosophy, I guess, to bring everybody in the loop, Angular's philosophy is they don't use sort of a templating language like a lot of other MVC frameworks use. Instead, they use data attributes. So they have one called ng-repeat that's basically handlebars each loop. And there's some real sort of benefits to doing it that way. And it was a little scary at first when I first dug into that. So the way that Ember handles that is by allowing you to create custom views, very similar to what we were talking about with the autocomplete. So does that make sense?
How do you test your EmberJS code?
So I prefer Angular for its testing. So Angular has thought it was written by one of the core guys that's contributed to it is Misko Hevery, and he's the code quality guy at Google. And so Angular was built from the ground up to be tested and to be testable. And we saw a presentation a couple months ago here about Testacular, which is now Karma, and how to integrate that and all that stuff. So I love how Angular is very testable. Ember is getting there. It's not perfect. Especially there are challenges. Ember has a concept of what's called a run loop, which means you can schedule stuff to happen later. And specifically that has to do with rendering. And so DOM manipulation is really expensive. If you've ever done sort of a lot of that built-in heavy app, DOM manipulation is probably where your browser is going to spend a heck of a lot of time. And so Ember really wanted to make that snappy. And so what they do is they schedule, they fire off, hey, this thing ought to change, this thing ought to change, this thing ought to change into the run loop. And then finally they have the run loop run and then execute all those DOM manipulation at once. And so, so there are some challenges associated with testing that. We've used Kanacha with Mocha, Chai in order to test. It's certainly testable for Ember apps. There are some things that for instance, controllers and views and things. Models are pretty easy. That's unit testing, right? But then from an end-to-end testing perspective, like you would do with like Cucumber in Rails, or Karma, right? Testacular and stuff. With Angular, it's not as good of an experience. Anything else?